It all started when I was aged about 4. I was in a bus with my mother and it came to a sudden stop, and we all looked out the window and a gentleman had been knocked off his motorbike, not by the bus, by a car, but the bus couldn't get past. And so everyone was looking horrified, and I was watching this fellow on the road. I can remember it like it was yesterday. And my mother said, "Get up the back of the bus, don't look." Because when you tell a child not to do something, what do? So I got up the back of the bus, but I continued. I could see, and the ambulance turned up from Hamilton. This was in Newcastle, and I saw the ambulance officers treating this gentleman, putting him on the stretcher into the ambulance, and off they went. And I distinctly remember saying to myself, I want to help people who are injured. And we went home and I mentioned that to my dad. I said, "Dad, I want to be an ambulance man." And he said to my mum, "Where'd you get that from?" She said, "Did you look out of the back of the bus?" Oh, no, of course I didn't. Well, age 9, I joined St John Ambulance at the Lambton Division out in Newcastle. And I was just amazed by what I was learning at that age, 9. And we used to go to carnivals and football matches and public events with a senior person, and I learnt a lot. Well, when I was age 12, we heard some bashing on the front door, and the lady said, "Where's Gary? There's been a crash down on the corner of Wallara Road and Hobart Road at New Lambton. Quick, we need him." We've rung the ambulance, and so my mother grabbed some blankets, and I grabbed my first aid kit, and I went down. A fellow had been projected out of the car and hit his head on the roadway, and I diagnosed very quickly he had a fractured base of the skull. He had bleeding from the nose and the ear and a little bit in the mouth. And so I got all the neighbours and we log rolled him onto his side to drain that blood out of his airways. And I got some newspaper, wrapped it up with tape and made a temporary cervical collar. Well, the ambulance turned up and the officer looked around and said, "Who's been treating this man?" And they pointed to me, "That boy there, he's in St John." And he said, "Son, you've saved his life." And so they continued to treat the gentleman, put him on the stretcher, and before they left, the ambulance officer said, "Come down to Hamilton Ambulance Station Saturday morning and I'll show you around." So I rode my bike down there and they showed me through the ambulance, and I was just, wow, look at this. As they were showing me, the phone went off and they answered the phone, and it was a febrile child, and they jumped in the ambulance and off they went with the lights and sirens. And you know what I thought? I thought at that minute, as I was watching them go, I would love to be in that ambulance. Then age 16, I came to Sydney to join the New South Wales Ambulance Cadetship Scheme. They had 2 schemes. One had already graduated. I think there was about 5 graduated in that one. Now, this scheme was to take 16-year-olds and turn us into ambulance officers. Part of that was 2 years full-time training, both in the ambulance training school and Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, Sydney Hospital as well. And so I started this amazing journey, age 16, and part of that training was we did the Nurses Preliminary Training School, 6 weeks in Royal Prince Alfred. Then we went around the wards to casualty, or ED they call it these days. And one of the things we had to do was to go down to the mortuary at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital to learn our anatomy. I remember saying to the doctor down there, "Oh, doctor, you must really get to know your anatomy doing a job like this." And he looked at me, he said, "You either know it or you don't." And I thought, uh-oh, keep your mouth shut. But I learnt some amazing things working around that hospital. Aged 18, we graduated from the ambulance training school, as they called it then, and I worked an ambulance out of headquarters in Sydney. It was in Quay Street in those days, aged 18, doing what we called then casualty calls and all sorts of different calls. And working one out, aged 18, in charge of an ambulance, one out, but we were highly trained and we knew exactly what we were doing. And of an evening, you might get an honorary bearer, that is, a volunteer would come in to work with you on the ambulance, and that was fantastic. Otherwise, you'd have to get a police officer or even a towie or someone to drive the ambulance to hospital while you treated the patient in the back. And so from there, I relieved around a lot of different stations. And when I was working on the east coast of Sydney, from the Randwick ambulance station, we used to get cliff rescues. And the sergeant in charge of police rescue said to me, "Hey, Ambo, will you go over? They've got a bloke with a broken back, an injured fisherman, and they're a bit hesitant. Could you go down over the cliff on the rope with them?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." So I went down the rope and packaged this patient, brought him up. When I got to the top, he said to me, "We need your skills in police rescue. Get out of the ambos and get into the cops and we'll get into rescue." And so that started a whole new era. But one comment about that, as a police officer, I always had the ambo in my mind. And as we say, I had that red and white checkered band, blood, always circulating. And when anything ever went wrong, "Where's Gary Raymond? He used to be an ambo. Get him, quick." And so it never left me. About 8:15 a.m. on the 18th of January 1977, I was with Police Rescue, and we just checked our equipment on the vehicles and were having a cup of coffee. And a call came in that a bridge had fallen on a train at Granville. We thought, well, I don't know how that had happened, but we went out there, and when we arrived, we saw the most incredible mess that I've ever seen in my life. We went to that northern culvert there and looked over the side, and my sergeant at the time, Sergeant Bill Fay, said, we looked down, there was 213 people injured everywhere, some unconscious, some sitting, some standing, some moaning, some screaming, some just silent, staring into space. He said to me, "Don't worry about them. The doctors, ambulance and nurses will look after them." He said, "You get in under that bridge, into those carriages and see what we've got." The train left the tracks, derailed, and hit the stanchions of the bridge. And carriage 1 was cut to the floor by the steel girders. Carriage 2 slipped under the bridge without a scratch. And then finally, the train derailed with carriages 3 and 4. Next minute, the bridge broke its back and came down squarely on the train. The bridge was 300 tonnes, and it came to rest roughly about a metre or so from the floor of the carriage. So you got the floor, about a metre, the roof, and then the bridge. So I climbed down on a rope and went along, and I crawled inside. The side of the train had been snapped out, so I was able to get into the side. And as I crawled through, I came across 80 people that had lost their lives immediately, suddenly. And after going through the 2 carriages, I found 10 people trapped. And this is interesting for this modern day paramedics. We found 10 people with crush syndrome, skeletal muscle compression, all at once. Suddenly, I smelled a smell. I thought, I don't believe it. Liquid petroleum gas. The carriages carried large gas cylinders, and which they heated the carriages in winter. And the bridge came down, crushed the cylinders, and the gas was coming out underneath in the carriages. And so then we had to stop using any equipment that might have created a spark, otherwise we get a levy, this massive explosion. And I remember one lady was saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And I thought, well, you're breathing okay at the moment, but she was compressed against the seat at the front. So I got my pocket knife out and I just cut the seat down the back, down the side, and pulled out the springs and the stuffing to flatten the seat and allowing this lady to breathe. And she said, "Oh, thank you, that's better." So I moved on from her, being triage trained. I came across a young lady who was an employee of the police, and she'd been accepted to go into the police academy. She stood up to give a lady her seat, an elderly lady, and when the bridge came down, that elderly lady lost her life instantly. But Debbie was standing at the back of the carriage, and when the bridge came down, it crushed the carriage end in and pushed her over and rolled her into a ball with her face literally compressed on her chest. And as I came in to her, I looked and I noticed, just as I was feeling her ABCs, she stopped breathing. And I couldn't get in because of the very confined space she was in. And so I could only get my hands in, and I grabbed her forehead and her jaw, and I lifted her head back, keeping the integrity of the cervical spine. And I pulled that jaw forward, and I couldn't get in to give her expired air resus. And I thought, she's going to die right in front of me. I just said, God, please, please let her live. And with that, one of the most beautiful sounds that I've ever heard in my life was, Debbie started to breathe on her own. And her colour got better, and I was able then to tell her, she said, what happened? Did an aeroplane crash in the train? I said, no, what's your name? She said, Debbie. I said, I'm Gary, and I'm going to get you out of here. I'm with Police Rescue, and I used to be an AMBO. And she said, oh, thank God you're here. I said, a bridge came down. Well, it took us 10 hours to get out 10 people. So that'll give you an idea of the entrapment they're in. These are the ones who are alive. And just about to get Debbie out, we'd extricated her from that confined space, and she suddenly grabbed her pelvis. She said, it's getting sore, it's getting sore. And so I said, well, I'll let the doctors and nurses know about that. So just stay still. And at this stage, she had an injury to every compartment, head, chest, abdomen. One of her legs was nearly severed traumatically, so I had to stop the bleeding earlier in the case with that. So as we're just about to get her out, she grabbed my hand and she said, Gary, do you think we'll ever be able to get married and have a baby? And I thought, what a question is that? And I just said to her, what only God knows. Only God knows, Debbie. We flew her to hospital by military helicopter. Now, just coming back a minute, not long after we were under there starting to rescue, my sergeant, Joe Beecroft, crawled in beside me and he whispered in my ear, he said, Gary, you've got to get out of here. The bridge is slipping very gradually. And I said, I've told people that I'm going to get them out. I can't leave them here. I've never left a patient in my ambulance days nor my rescue date. Never left anyone. And he said, you have to get out. And I said, I'll get really low beside the girders, and if it comes down, I'll be protected. He said, I direct you to get out of here now. Well, you've got to do what the sergeant says, otherwise you're in a bit of bother. So I crawled out, the engineers stabilised it, and I crawled back in. But I reached Debbie and I said to her, I'm back, Debbie. She said, I knew you'd be back. And so that was a wonderful thing, that she knew we'd be back. And that's the confidence that people put in paramedics and police officers. Well, a couple of years later, I got a call to go on a show called Where Are They Now? And so I turned up there. I didn't know what it was all about. And next minute, the audience, they called me in and said, here's Gary Raymond, one of the heroes of the Granville train disaster. Well, out of the bright lights came this young lady on a frame, and it was Debbie. And we just cuddled and cried. And there's that bond between rescuer and patient, saving a life. And there's a special bond between you and someone you save. Well, as we cuddled, we gradually settled down, and she whispered in my ear, thank you for saving my life. And I said it was worth it. Well, behind me, this young lady brought in a baby and handed it to me. And Debbie said, Gary, that's my little daughter Shelby, that's my husband down there, Steve. And guess what? Remember you said God knew? Well, God knew. Look at this. And so here's this darling little miracle baby. And so we've kept in touch. Debbie and I have regular coffees and with Steve and Shelby, and it's just that bond will never be broken. Yeah, I retired from the police force, and I got a phone call and said, you're a salvo, would you be interested in becoming an ambulance chaplain? And I said, I'd love to do that, because I always felt a connection with ambulance. And it's funny, there's two, I suppose, cohorts of people. There's those who never want to hear the word ambulance ever again, and there's those who feel attached, even though they've retired or former. And so I always felt attached, even though I was in a police uniform. When I went to a job, I was sort of like a cop and an ambo at the same time. So I was so pleased, did the training, and they've deployed me into the area of legacy, which is looking after retired and former ambulance officers and paramedics. It's really good because the chaplaincy, we just consider ourselves like fire extinguisher on the wall. We sit there, and if they want us, they grab us. And we can be both proactive and reactive. We can follow people up or be ready for people. And look, God made us with 2 ears and 1 mouth for a good reason. Most chaplaincy is listening and just empathising and validating their feelings and reminding them that this is their brain chemistry firing off, and not they're okay, but their brain is saying threat, catastrophe, memories, flashbacks. And so part of the chaplaincy too is attending and doing funerals for ambulance officers that might have passed away. And that's great because we meet with the family and we reminisce over the ambulance officers or paramedics' service and just really show them to be connected. And we do things like in Legacy we give a wreath, and we can give a flag sometimes, and the family come up to me and they say, thank you, we still feel part of the family. The ambulance chaplaincy is part of the overall well-being. We've got our psychologists, we've got our peers, and we've got all these well-being programs, and we're just a part of that.